right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I am Lauren Weston. I'm the district manager with the Franklin County Natural Resources Conservation District, and thank you all for being here. Just as a disclaimer, you might have noticed we are recording today, so anything that you say or share will be recorded for future use. Thank you very much. All right. Welcome to webinar 1 of the Soil Health Training Program webinar series. This is the Soil Health Principles and Ecosystem Services webinar. I wanted to start today with a big thank you to the Lake Champlain Basin Program and NUIPIC for funding to create this training program for everyone. Thank you very much. I also wanted to thank our advisory group, the folks on the screen, and many of you who attended the in-person event are in this photo, and we could not have pulled this off without all of your help, so thank you. The agenda for today, I'm going to go through a quick training program background, our offerings and expectations of you. Mel will join us and explain how to use Campus. Then I'll do a quick homework review. Then we'll talk to some of our wonderful presenters who have joined us here today, as well as a Q&A session, and then a review of what to expect and prepare for next week. So a quick training program background. Some of you may have seen this already, but why are we here? I just wanted to impress upon everyone that we've had so far 99 participants sign up for this course, which is pretty exciting. And we decided a couple of years ago as a group of conservation districts and other technical assistance providers in Vermont that a lot of the folks who are working on the ground with land stewards have really diverse backgrounds, and not all of us have the same knowledge. And so we wanted to come together and learn together, especially about soil health. And we also wanted to make sure we were communicating the same messages and also the nuances of soil health. And so for this training program, our goals are collective learning in a welcoming and safe space, improving the social mycelium, so building those connections with other people who are interested in this work and are doing this work on the ground, making sure we have more prepared and confident technical assistance providers so that we can implement better practices and behaviors on the ground through our help to land stewards to get improved outcomes. We're also using this webinar series as a training tool for future providers. So even if folks aren't yet in their roles that they will be in the future, we hope that you will be able to use this information and use it on the ground in your roles. And so our offerings to you all, we hosted one in-person workshop in November, thanks to those who could make it. For those who couldn't, we do have recordings that are being added to our online resource. We also have some other resources that will be posted there. And then starting today are the 12 Tuesday webinars. And so we'll go every Tuesday except for skipping some on some holidays. All of the dates are written on this screen, but you should have also gotten a calendar invite from me for all of those dates. And the way that we're structuring these webinars is that there are preparatory readings, mostly from Building Soils for Better Crops. And what the goal of those readings is to kind of get the universals, and then we'll come into these live webinars and talk about more of the Vermont context specific items on the ground in Vermont. How is this being applied? So on the screen, you can see all of the dates, all of the titles, and all of the speakers for all 12 of those webinars. Then in 2024, over the field season, we will have 4 workshops in various parts of the state and on various landscapes to really apply what we're learning in these webinars. So thank you all for joining us. Our expectations of you is that you will do your homework, you will engage with the resources outside of these webinars, you'll ask questions and be curious, you'll engage with others to help build that social mycelium, you'll focus on understanding context and thinking about how to actually apply what you're learning on the ground and into your work. And you're also helping create a valuable training program for others. So we're gonna ask for your feedback often, and we really do want your feedback often. This is a living, breathing training program. So please, if you're not getting what you think you should be or what you wanted, please let us know. Also, just wanted to impress you all know more than you think, and trust your gut. There's no stupid questions here. We're all here to learn together in a really safe space. I would now like to invite everyone to introduce yourself in the chat if you're willing. If you want to say your name and where you work or anything else you'd like us to know, please feel free. I'm going to pass it over to Mel to explain how to use Canvas. And well, thank you, Mel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mel. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the FC NRCD's Natural Resources Planner. I'm going to pop a link to the Extension Foundation campus into the chat after everyone's introduced themselves, so it doesn't get lost in there. And if you haven't registered for the course yet on campus, please do so. There are a ton of great resources on there. So I'm going to share my screen. So this is what the website looks like. You would register by going down to this area where it says search courses, and this course title is Soil Health Training Program. And it's the only result, and it has Mel, Susan, and Lauren as teachers. So you're going to click there, and there will be a button where you can enroll in the course. So I'm just going to quickly go through what the course looks like and how you can use it. There is the navigation on the left side of the screen that you can use to easily access any week. And then at the top, there's the welcome letter, the course coordinator. That's just our contact information. If you want to email or call us with any questions about this course, feel free to do so. And then there is just a few lists of some great resources that you are welcome to check out. And then there's information on our fall workshop, which already happened. We do have a Zoom recording, and we had a filmographer who came and recorded the event for us. And once that is ready, it's going to be put up. So you are welcome to check out any of that if you missed our workshop. And then for each webinar, we're going to have a week section. And this, I'm just going to quickly go through the first week because they all look pretty much the same. There's the required reading, and all of this required reading is just from the course textbook. If you came to the workshop, you might have gotten a copy. If you don't have a copy, that's totally fine. There are free PDFs of all the chapters linked here. So you can access those. And then for each webinar, you can click on this and it will have the date, the time, and the Zoom link. So if you're ever having trouble accessing these webinars, you can go here. There will also be speaker bios available for every presenter that will be joining us. When we're finished, the recording will be put here. And then also we have a webinar evaluation form that we would love for everyone to fill out after every webinar so we can get feedback and really tailor this course to all of our needs. And then there are recommended resources. We know everyone has limited time, so these are not required. But if you're interested in each week's topic, please go through these. These were put together by our Soil Health Advisory Group, and these people are really knowledgeable and have put together all these great resources. So if you really want to learn more, it's available. And then finally, there's a discussion section, which is also not required, but this is just another way that you can reach out to us to ask questions. So please feel free to do that. And we will be notified of anyone who posts in the discussion so we can be sure to get back to you as quickly as possible. Yeah, and so then there's 12 weeks. And at the end of this are our field workshops for 2024. Which are all to be determined, and more information will be available about those on campus as we go forward. Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mel. All right. So everyone's favorite part of being in a training program is the homework. I just wanted to reiterate here that there were some pre-course required resources that we hope folks were able to view in advance. We're working on these webinars under the assumption that you are keeping up with the readings and have done the pre-course required resource review. That's quite a mouthful. And so hopefully by coming prepared to the webinars, some of the more foundational components and concepts will be in your brain already, and we can really dive into the on-the-ground context in Vermont. And so I also just made a quick outline of what you should have read from our course textbook of Building Soils for Better Crops. I did just want to also acknowledge, I know that it's called Building Soils for Better Crops, but a lot of the principles that are being discussed in this book apply beyond farms into forests in residential areas. And so we are taking that bigger picture of the whole landscape, even though the title of the book is Better Crops. And so again, just make sure that you've reviewed the course text in advance. And if you don't have time for it, make sure you review it at some point in your life. It's a great textbook. And wonderful. All right, with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to introduce Kat Buxton. So Kat, if you want to start loading your presentation, I'll introduce Kat Buxton, who is a busy cross-pollinator and change facilitator in Sharon, Vermont. Her business is called Grow More, Waste Less. She is an effective and enthusiastic educator, collaborative community organizer, and advocate for food system change and a just transition. She talks incessantly about soil, compost, bugs, and plants. Her latest projects are the Regeneration Core, the Super Compost Project, and building a soil foundation at Birch Forest Farm. With that, welcome, Kat, and we're very excited to learn from you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here and really excited to be a part of this course and continue on my learning journey. So I'm going to give an overview of soil health principles today as defined by the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And we're all here because we understand that soil is a very important part of our world. And we lose it really pretty quickly. If it's not held together by soil aggregates and all of the billions of organisms that help to make that happen, we lose soil pretty quickly. This is a pretty famous picture showing basically Vermont's dirt roads and some farm fields heading into Long Island Sound after Tropical Storm Irene. I can't see the words at the bottom because my Zoom stuff is on top of it, but you can read about the amazing amount of money that was lost. And that's not actually including a single penny for soil. We have had a lot of disasters, as you all know, and after this summer's flooding, it's really hitting home to us how much our weather is changing and how fragile our landscape is, and that we might want to begin rethinking about how we manage our greater landscape. And I know there are conversations happening statewide in the legislature about that as well. This is a really interesting map that's a little bit shocking to just see how many places have had to have infrastructure repair because of flooding and climate disasters just since 2013. Some pictures, there are lots of them on Google these days. Vermont flooding yields all kinds of devastating pictures. Many of them feature farmland. And as Lauren had mentioned, soil health, of course, has a lot more to do with our livelihood and protecting ecosystems and all of the services that ecosystems perform. All start with a foundation of soil. It's where our water is held. And we hopefully can work together and learn from nature ways that we can change our behavior to help change the way that our landscapes are responding to climate catastrophes. We are increasing in precipitation quicker than we anticipated and quicker than the rest of the country in terms of frequency and amount of rain that is falling each time it rains. So we know this is going to continue to happen. So as we start planning and continue planning for managing landscapes and growing crops. These are really important pieces to consider. How much rain we're going to get. And we don't know what the amount's going to be, but we know it's going to be more than we've seen and will continue to increase. These are the soil health principles as defined by the Natural Resources Conservation Service with a couple of amendments. Numbers 2 through 5 are really featured by the NRCS, and many soil health advocates around the world are also talking about the rest of these. So I think it's really important to start with context. The soil health principles are very broad. They can be applied anywhere from a rooftop garden to the Mojave Desert to mountaintops and to our deep, lush soils in the Midwest and in every context in Vermont. But it is important first to know what your context is. So in this short slideshow, we're going to go through each one of these. And the first one is context. Where are you? Where in the world are you? What's your topography like? What are the physical attributes, your soil quality? What's your parent minerals? You know, what are all of the physical things that you can think about of the place that you are? And that's a really important place to start. Then trying to understand how the land has been used over time. What was it before this crop and before that and before that and before that? Because that history really helps to form the soil that's right underneath our feet and how it will respond to water and other climate elements. So what's on the land now and how are we trying to use this? This is also an important question. Are you trying to grow a forest? Are you trying to grow corn? Are you trying to grow pollinator habitat? Are you trying to raise grass for livestock? And it needs to be super nutritious and diverse. So what we have and where we're going are really important framing for anything that we're going to do in applying soil health principles. And also thinking about what are the limitations. So what do we have and what don't we have? Do we not have any sunlight? Do we not have water nearby? Do we have highly compacted soil? Can we change that? Really understanding what your limitations are will help to determine what's possible in a landscape. And if you have some limitations that will prevent the dreams for the land, it may be time to reconsider the dream. Always thinking about principles too, in terms of principle over practice. There are many, many, many different kinds of practices that we can use on landscapes, all based in the context of where we are, what we have, where we're going, and what our limitations are. But the principles, putting those over top of practices and really thinking about what are the outcomes that are coming from these practices, or something I would like to encourage folks to be thinking about. So practices are often based on models, and models are changing, as we saw on that last map with the weather and how much water we're going to be getting. So it's important to just be considering that our models may not be as accurate as we hope. The second principle is living roots in the ground for as long as possible with green growing plants on top. And depending on your context, those plants are going to look very different. So again, I'm going to keep saying that word context. I really want you to be thinking about context in everything that you're doing with soil health and how we're applying principles. This is a famous picture. It's not mine. This is from Prairie Southwest soils. It's obviously hand drawn, but one of the things I love about it is it shows the potential root depth of soil given conditions. With Vermont's bedrock underneath us, we might not necessarily reach these depths in certain places. And when we think about all of the biology that lives underneath the ground, living in the rhizosphere, which is that microscopic place around every root system, it's really exciting to think about the depth of root systems and the kinds of populations and biodiversity of organisms that we can get by having vast root systems. This is that little rhizosphere indicated by the blue area around the very tiny root hair. That's that brown thing in there. The little white bits are mycorrhizal fungus representing fungal hyphae. That is a major communication system that we're really just beginning to scratch the surface of understanding. And there are people much smarter than me on this call that hopefully will be able to talk more about what we do know. And then those little red things are some of the microbes that we're thinking about. In this case, they're really pointing out bacteria. And this is who we're trying to foster when we're creating conditions for healthy soil. This is the soil food web, which was coined as a term in the mid-90s. So it's really pretty darn new. And understanding that there are multiple layers within a food web and that we need every piece of it in order for nutrient cycling to happen with the efficiency that nature has always done so. And as we change the context of our landscapes and make them more compacted, less natural, depleted, the soil food web is absolutely affected by those things. But the good news is that we do have the power and the knowledge to help create conditions to foster thriving soil food webs in our communities. And keeping your context in mind is really important. This one is principle 3, and I can't see my Zoom thing here. So this is all about biodiversity. So more biodiversity everywhere, above the ground, below the ground, diversity of practices, diversity of organisms, diversity of plants. I'd like to say diversity of thinking is also really important as well. It's always impressive to me when I take the time to notice how much diversity you can find in 1 square foot of a healthy ecosystem, and really be thinking about how can we foster the most biodiversity in our ecosystem and trust that that biodiversity is actually what's feeding us all and holding our landscapes together. Minimizing disturbance of all kinds is an important thing to do as a land manager. Also recognizing that disturbance is a necessary part of nature, and there's plenty of it without us causing more of it. So disturbance can look like large machinery. It can look like small shovels. It can look like fertilizers and pesticides. It can look like compaction. It can look like flooding or drought or volcanoes. Some of those things we're able to create, and some of those things we aren't, thank goodness. But really trying to minimize the amount of disturbance that we're bringing into a landscape. And I think it's important to really think about or keep in mind minimizing it. We're not saying no disturbance. As I mentioned, disturbance happens in nature all the time, and it's actually a really important thing. And even in regenerative livestock management, the hoof action, the damage or the disturbance that hooves will do to a landscape are actually creating conditions to increase biodiversity in the landscape and nutrient cycling. But being aware that disturbance is a thing and that everything responds to that disturbance would be an important thing to keep in mind. How we manage land affects carbon cycling. So these are some pretty famous pictures. The one on the bottom left is something I like to talk about. This is from the archives of Alan Savory. And basically what's happening there is the same livestock is being managed on both sides of that fence. The only difference is that on the left side of the fence, they started using rotational grazing. So moving the animals around, really trying to mimic much like the way the buffalo and the wildebeest used to be in large herds, not returning to a place for a long period after regeneration. And you can just see, just in that 2-dimensional picture, that the way that carbon and water move on the left side of the fence are very different than what's on the right side of the fence. And again, all that was changed here was management. So a simple change in management can really have an impact in the outcomes, and paying attention to those outcomes is critical. Animals on the landscape are really important. Whether it's a vegan or vegetarian thing or not, nature never, ever, ever farms without animals. From the smallest bacteria to elephants and giraffes, there's always somebody there eating and chewing and pooping. And that's a really critical piece of our ecosystem. So understanding that the way we manage animals on landscapes will have a big impact on the outcome of that landscape is something to really be thinking about, and getting creative. And I'd like to say mimicking nature whenever possible, because she's brilliant. If we follow our soil health principles in context, we will find that water will follow. We will be able to manage our watersheds in a better way. I think it's probably better to say that our ecosystems will have the conditions created for water to be managed. It's not that we're managing it. It's that we're creating conditions for natural ecosystem function to happen, and we're stepping back and allowing that to happen. So can we divert water? Can we capture it? Can we stop wasting it? It is a gift, and while we'll be getting a lot more of it, we will also be getting long periods without any of it. So figuring out ways to create the conditions for soil to become that sponge to hold water retention throughout times of drought, I think are going to be really critical going forward, no matter what it is we're trying to manage on our farms. And always asking ourselves, how can we support the landscape to create ecosystem function, to regenerate ecosystems, and how can we support land managers as educators and as technical service providers to create the conditions for thriving in biodiverse ecosystems that really benefit us all. The primary picture that you're looking at there, some of those words are way too small, so I put them big in the green panel on the right. It's just some of the outcomes from healthy ecosystems. And on the bottom are just some of the impacts of broken ecosystems. And the picture, really just look at that flower petal. On the left side as a natural ecosystem, which is providing all of the functions that ecosystems need in order to survive. And I think it would be unwise for us to think we know what all of those are, but we do have a pretty good list. And in the middle, we have, at the expense of just crops for humans, we've let many of our ecosystem services and functions go by the wayside. So on the right side, how can we make that flower whole and do both? How can we create the food and fiber and medicines that we need, while also creating the conditions for regenerating ecosystems? And I propose, as many do, that by following the soil health principles, keeping them in mind, really focusing on context before you dive in, is the way to do that. And as technical service providers, I think another really important part of context that's not really mentioned here is the context of the humans that we're working with. What are the limitations there? You know, money is a limitation, land is a limitation, time, capacity, muscle, machinery. These are all really important parts of the context as we work to advise land managers to do the best they can for the best possible outcomes in their landscape. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kat. Always wonderful to learn from you. I do want to invite folks, as you have questions throughout this webinar, please put them in the chat. We will be tracking them and we will be asking them in the Q&A session at the end. With that, I'm going to invite Doug to start sharing your screen, and I will introduce the first of our panel of three diverse folks who came to talk to us today to really emphasize kind of what Kat was saying, but also to inspire curiosity, to be thinking through many different lenses. What we're really hoping to do as part of this work is to encourage different voices and different perspectives, and let all the participants here kind of figure out what resonates with you and what you want to bring into the field with you as technical assistance providers. And so our first panelist today is Doug Wolcik, and Doug and his partner Kaylee own and operate Breadseed Farm in Craftsbury, Vermont. Breadseed is a 1-acre, no-till, regeneratively managed vegetable farm. The farm grows veggies, herbs, and flowers, but its main focus is in building soil biology and health. Doug holds a degree in sustainable agriculture and community food systems from UMass Amherst. Before starting Breadseed Farm in 2021, Doug managed Gaining Ground Farm in Concord, Mass., where he monumentally increased plant health and yields through a focus on soil health. Doug has proven himself as a thought leader and visionary for small-scale farming. He is passionate about staying on the forefront of farm innovation while staying true to the simplicity of a no-till system. Doug is traded in the Great Salt Marsh for the Green Mountains and is loving living rurally. And this will be his 16th year farming. With that, Doug, I will hand it over to you if you want to come off mute on your phone. There you go.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can. Sound great.
Great. All right. Well, first off, thanks, Lauren. Thank you to the Franklin County NRCD for having me speak today and be a part of this great webinar. It's really exciting work that you guys are doing, and I'm glad to be a part of it. So yeah, like Lauren said, I'd like to expand on some of my background. I studied soils and sustainable ag at the University of Massachusetts. After graduating from UMass, I took an apprenticeship in Northern California where I got to really pair some of the science background that I learned at school with some practical applications on a real small family farm. It was really instrumental in my growth as a young farmer. From there, I did some woofing and backpacking through South America, got to work on permaculture farms in Chile and Argentina and Peru and Ecuador before landing at Gain and Ground in 2013. Gain and Ground is a nonprofit farm in Concord, Mass. All of the food that it grows, it donates to hunger relief organizations in the greater Boston area. They are partnered with 15 different organizations. I came on there as a co-manager in 2013, and the farm was growing on 3 acres and producing about 34,000 pounds of food that it was donating to these partner organizations. It was an organic farm, not certified, but tractor-based farm. When landing on the farm, you could just walk onto the farm and kind of see that the soil was pretty depleted. It was very sandy. And we struggled growing crops each and every year. So in 2016, we attended some soil and nutrition conferences held by the Bionutrient Food Association, Dan Kittredge, where we learned a little bit about soil minerals and balancing, and how to treat the soil rather than treating the plant or, reacting to stunted growth or negative things happening while trying to grow food. So in 2016, we started to transition Gain and Ground a real small sample size at a time. We transitioned one 30 by 72 foot high tunnel. There we, were focused on soil biology and having that interaction with the life in the soil, interacting with the plants. So we transitioned that house to no-till. We created permanent beds. We brought in a bunch of compost and we stopped tilling. We grew a winter crop that year, and then a spring crop. And then that first year when we planted our tomatoes in that high tunnel that summer, we were immediately floored with the results. We saw such an increase in yield, in plant health, reduction in pest, disease, and weeds immediately, better water holding capacity in the soil. It was just hands down, you could see it like it was night and day. The soil was really starting to regenerate itself just in, that was 6 months of no-till right there. So we decided that we had to, scale this up and start doing that over the whole farm. The farm was 3 acres. So in 2017, we put 1.5 acres into no-till. In 2018, we put the last 1.5 acres into no-till. So by 2020, my last year at Gain and Ground, we produced 129,000 pounds of food on the same piece of land, same acreage. That was a 95,000 pound increase from when I started in 2013. Over 300% of increased amount of food on the same piece of land while increasing organic matter from when I started in 2013, from 3%, you know, it was a sandy piece of land, to over 7% in 2020. And I kind of attribute that to 2017. Once we had a full year of no-till under our belt, we started increasing organic matter at 1% per year for the last 4 years. Seeing the results that we saw at Gain and Ground, Kaylee and my partner, we decided to take the leap, you know, knowing what we could produce now on a piece of land and how we could increase the soil, or increase the health of the soil, the plants, and not struggle year to year being growers. We decided to take the leap. We started looking for land in the Northeast Kingdom where she grew up. That's kind of where we wanted to settle. We were in the Boston area, and we decided to, you know, that wasn't the right place for us, to look rurally where we could afford land. So in 2020, while looking for a piece of land, I think the most important thing we did was look at web soil surveys. The NRCS has about 95% of soils mapped throughout the country. So any piece of land or home or property that came on the market that we were interested in, we were cross-referencing that through the web soil survey website, where you can just plug in an address, and it'll GPS pinpoint you to the location. You can trace out the land there. You can it'll tell you the size of the land, the slope, the soil type, the organic matter levels. So we found this really great piece of land in Craftsbury that was designated as prime agricultural land in the state of Vermont. We came up and did some soil tests before purchasing the land. It was over 6% organic matter. So in 2021, we started the farm. That first year, we grew a ½ acre of vegetables, and we were attending just one farmer's market. We had a small CSA, and we were selling to our local general store. Now in 2023, this past year, we grossed over $150,000 of produce on 1 acre. We've doubled in our size, and we're attending 3 farmers markets, plus a larger CSA and wholesale accounts. And to set up this farm, we did till once. So we had a neighbor come in with a tractor. He tilled the land because it was sod. It was an old horse pasture. We had a neighbor come in, tilled up the lawn, incorporated it, and then we set up permanent bed system. The beds are 30 inches wide, 12-inch pathways, 50 feet long. We have 224 of those beds on the farm in production right now, and we're managing it as after that one-time till to get the soil up and going so we could produce food that first year. We have never brought in heavy equipment or tractors onto the field. We've just brought in material such as wood chips, compost, organic fertilizers, and the farm is now producing a ton of food, and we're really excited about where we're at. That's a long intro to where I'm at. This is our field. This is in year 1. So about 6 months after tilling the land and getting stuff going, just immediately soil health right there, keeping this, the farm running and producing. So that's the farm now. And then we use our approach with the soil is more of a 3-pronged approach. We're attacking the soil 3 different ways. One is chemically, not to be confused with chemical fertilizers, but nutrition, chemical composition, makeup of the soil. Second would be biological, and third would be physical. Number 1, this was our first foray in our relationship and understanding of soil health and how it developed over time was chemical. After attending soil and nutrition conferences and learning about mineral balancing and how these nutrients interrelate and how they react to the amounts of one another, and understanding that as feeding the soil, not the plant. Getting the soil in balance will level out your pH to where you need it to be, will create a balance between, say, calcium and boron, and it'll get your soil in balance so you can start growing healthier plants that will start to, see a reduction in weeds and pests and disease. This was really important, and this was a big moment for us, understanding how the soil nutrients all related to one another. And we were putting down minerals for the first couple of years and not seeing them, we weren't seeing the results that we wanted. We knew that it takes time and that these things need to break down and have interaction with soil microbes to be available for plants, but we weren't seeing the results we wanted immediately. Then we discovered in 2017 that the biology is really what unlocks all of the nutrients in the soil, and it'll start creating that feedback loop and that holistic relationship between plant roots and soil microbiology. So in addition to soil balancing and mineral addition, we then took a more of a biological approach. This was encouraged by Elaine Ingham, who really, encourages the living soil food web, which Kat mentioned, the soil microbiology, fungi, earthworms, not disturbing those things, minimizing disturbing that. So we stopped using the tractor completely. We brought a broad fork and started aerating our soil that way. And then this made the biggest difference of all. We immediately saw plant health increase. The plants were just bigger, healthier. They were taking in more photosynthesis from the sun because they were bigger, healthier plants. The root systems were growing bigger, deeper, accessing nutrients that were maybe unavailable before because of compaction issues. So the plant starts taking in more nutrients from the soil, in more nutrition from the sun. You have a bigger, healthier plant that's then storing all of this nutrition in its root system. In an annual vegetable production, most of the time we're harvesting a crop and not pulling the roots from the soil. So in annual production, the crops will store about 40% of all the nutrition it has taken in from the sun and up from the soil in its root system. We come in and harvest, say, that head of lettuce, that 40% of that nutrition is still in its root system. So instead of coming in with a tiller or pulling those roots from the ground, we're harvesting the crop right at the base of the soil, leaving the root system in there to break down, decompose, release all that nutrition, those exudates, releases those as sugars into the soil that then feed the bacteria, the mycelium in the soil. And those mycelium and the bacteria are getting bigger and stronger because they're being fed these carbohydrates that the plant has taken in and released into the soil as sugars. So they're getting bigger and stronger and going out and mining and interacting with more nutrition to feed the next round of crops that are going in. So we always leave the soil wholly undisturbed, even if it's a big broccoli plant, we're cutting it at the base of the soil, leaving the root system in there, and then just offsetting our planting so that the next crop that comes in is planted offset from the broccoli root. So the new crop gets planted, the roots are in the growing zone of the new crop, are interacting with the roots of the old crop. So everything is just feeding one another, and you get this feedback loop that one crop after another relay is feeding one another, one after another. So that's been our biological approach on the farm. Thirdly has been physical. The physical makeup of your soil, largely you can have sandy soils, silt soils, or clay soils. We grow on a Buxton loam. It's a little bit clayey once you get down beyond 6 inches of the topsoil. So we think physical as kind of mimicking the forest. What do we want to do here? Kat touched on a lot of these issues. We're minimizing soil disturbance that allows for biological. We're relay cropping, so we're always having living plant roots. We're keeping the soil covered. And how we're keeping that covered is, you can see in this photo here, we have wood chips in all our pathways. We don't want the wood chips in the bed because they potentially could tie up nitrogen. Our beds are topped with initially 2 inches of compost. When we started the farm, we went 2 inches thick over that 30-inch wide bed there. And that's keeping the native parent soil covered. So after the addition of compost, we lightly broad fork the beds, plants go in, they grow, we harvest them out, we cut the soil at the plant at the base of the soil. Our next crop goes in. And then we're also using, to change the physical, we're adding compost. That's making our clayey soil a little less clayey. You can use it if you're sandy, the compost will make the sandy a little less sandy. You're creating a nice middle ground for that the soil can then hold better. It has a better water holding capacity, has a better letting go of water in flood instances. And then we're using a variety of mulches. So wood chips in the pathways, we're bringing in all our fall leaves. We collect all our fall leaves. They go in the garden. And then salt marsh hay. I grew up on the Northeast coast. We know the hay farmers down there that deliver us 400 bales of hay every fall to use over the next growing season. We're using salt marsh hay. This is a great product because you want to be really careful with the hay that you're using, that you're not introducing new weed seed onto the farm. So the amazing thing about salt marsh hay is any of the weed seed that is in the hay cannot germinate without interaction with salt water. It's from tidal salt marsh, so there's salt marsh water plants. So there's no weed, we're not introducing new weed seed and they're not germinating. Cover crops is a great one. This is a great great shot of half the field in cover crop and half it being tarped. We use these black silage tarps as occultation. So whenever a crop isn't in and it isn't being cover cropped, mulched, or have a living plants growing in there, stuff that we're going to harvest, we'll use these black silage tarps is what they wrap big round bales of hay in. And those are only for like a very short time. If if in our crop plan we had a 2-week interval, but when one crop came out to one crop came in, we'll just cover with that black tarp. It's not heating up the soil because it's UV treated, so it's not heating up the soil, so the soil doesn't get that big spike in temperature and kill all the good stuff that we're not trying to destroy by tilling. So it's just creating this nice, humid, warm, nice moisture content under that tar. And 2 weeks later, we take it off, and any of this material that was under there is perfectly decomposed. The soil is like chocolate cake, and it is ready to be replanted immediately. So that tarp basically serves as our tillage on the farm. Those will last about 10 years. They're not breaking down at all. So it is a bit of plastic use, which isn't our favorite thing. And we're working away from using those tarps. But in the interim, while we're starting a new farm and getting the farm established, those tarps serve a huge purpose. We're also pretty understaffed at the moment because we're young, and we wanted to get some numbers and data behind selling for the first 3 years, that those tarps are pretty instrumental in use to, for us to get to our objectives and our goals on the farm. So yeah, and that's the physical approach. So with all three, we're able to, really spearhead and attack the soil from all different angles. I think diversity, we're growing a diversity of crops. So I think diversity in soil or diversity in a soil health approach is the most important aspect of our farm. And it allows us to be, we think of ourselves as soil farmers. We're not vegetable farmers. We're building healthy soil. We just grow vegetables. We're creating healthy habitat for plants to grow in. We just plant the plants in the ground. We have healthy starts. We're good at growing in the greenhouse. We have healthy starts. We put them in this amazing soil. 30 to 60 to 90 days later, whatever it may be for that crop, we can come and get a harvest off of it. We want to do everything that we can to not disrupt or disturb the soil, or break the chain that's happening underneath the living organisms that we understand very little about, but we want to allow those things to do their thing, and we just want to have the least amount of impact on it while being a marketable farm and being able to sustain this piece of land and make a living off of it. And things are doing great. We're in our second year of not tilling at the farm, and the results are really incredible. We're able to produce a ton of food on the farm. We're able to feed, people in our community. Our piece of land that we bought in Craftsbury started at 6.5% organic matter, is now over 8% organic matter just from us growing over on it for the last 3 years. Gaining ground, I had a larger, longer sample size, but we were able to create, bigger, healthier plants, less pest, disease, weeds, over 4 years, and increase that growing capacity there, by threefold. So lots of studies are showing that the biology is what really unlocks all the nutrition in the soil. Elaine Ingham says that all the nutrients are there. We do not need to be buying off-farm inputs. That if we have healthy soil, biologically active soil, we can have access to all these nutrients just by putting the plants in, allowing them to grow, set deep roots, and do the thing that they do without a lot of off-farm inputs. So every decision we make on the farm, we go over, is it in line with these 5 principles of regenerative farming or any good farming practices? Minimizing soil disturbance. Like I said, we did that one-time tillage just so we could start producing food that first year. That was, to get into a pasture would be a longer approach with tarps or cardboard or a lot of compost to, cover an old pasture or grassland. So after that one-time tillage, that as minimal as possible, that tiller is there, and that's a tool. And if you need it, great, you should use it. I don't want to be dogmatic about it, but trying to minimize that. And even some people would argue that the broad fork is soil disturbance, which it is. But we think of that tool as something that will over time make itself obsolete. It'll work itself out of it a job. So by continuing broad forking over these past 2 years, it's just getting easier and easier. The compaction is breaking up. We're able to just dig our arm in deeper and deeper each time we go in there. Always having living plant roots. To us, that's mostly cash crops. When cash crops aren't in, cover crop is in. Keeping the soil covered. Go back to number 2, that would be with crops that we can grow and harvest for people to eat. Second would be with cover crops, and third and fourth would be with mulches, leaves, hay, or wood chips. Plant diversity. We're always rotating our crops, keeping diversity of plant material in there. We're intercropping, planting alyssum under our tomatoes because they host the parasitic wasp that'll parasitize tomato hornworm. So we're finding all these pairings. So kale, for instance, brassicas don't have a symbiotic relationship with soil fungi. So underneath our kale, we plant herbs, whether it's parsley, cilantro, or dill, something in there while that long kale crop is in there, something to create a relationship that's feeding the fungi in the soil. And then integration of livestock. Currently, our integration of livestock is through compost. So we're buying in Vermont compost, this Vermont Compost Company. So we are lucky. We have Carl Hammer, the owner operator of Vermont Compost Company, is basically in our backyard in East Montpelier. Creates some of the best compost in the country. So we have access to that. We buy that in bulk, and that is a diversified compost blend. It has cow, horse, donkey, chicken manure, that, and then like Kat said, going back to animals, all the invertebrates, the little bugs, worms that are interacting, eating and pooping right there on your soil. We don't raise any animals, but we consider them our livestock. So yeah, and I think Lauren will leave some questions at the end.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Doug. Yes, we will we'll leave the questions till the end. Yeah, if you're able to go on mute and then stop sharing your screen, we can get Caitlin to set up hers. Thank you so much for going to such incredible detail about what you are seeing on the farm and how you are impacting your landscape. Thank you very much just for sharing that gift with us. Our next presenter is Caitlin Hicks Pries. And so Caitlin has loved all things soil since digging for clams in the salt marshes of New England with her grandmother. Caitlin is an ecosystem ecologist researching how soils respond to climate change and how soils can be managed to help mitigate climate change with a focus on the forests and pastures of northern New England. Caitlin's also a graduate of Middlebury College. She received her master's in soil science and a doctorate in biology at the University of Florida, and then completed a postdoc at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in Berkeley, California. Caitlin is currently an associate professor at Dartmouth College, where she teaches classes in ecology and global change biology. She has won early career awards from the Soil Science Society of America and the Biogeosciences Division of the European Geosciences Union. With that, it looks like your screen looks great, Caitlin. If you want to go ahead and take over.
All right. Thank you, Lauren, for inviting me to be part of this webinar today. This is going to be a little different as I'm not a practitioner, that I do get to work with a lot of you with my research. I'm going to focus today on a certain soil ecosystem service that is highly related to soil health, and that is soil carbon sequestration. And I have my email down here. It's caitlin.hicks.pries@dartmouth.edu if you need to contact me or have any questions later. So, there we go. So soils store 3 times the amount of carbon as our atmosphere. It's about 800 petagrams. So 800 petagrams is in the atmosphere. There's 3,000 petagrams in the soils. This is equivalent to 7.5 billion 747 jets. So it's a lot of carbon. And the big question of my research is what's going to happen with global change? Can we harness soils to be our friend and take carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it in soils? Or will global change cause soils to become our foe, whereby warming temperatures increases biological activity in soils to such a degree that we're losing more CO2 to the atmosphere, where it's causing a positive feedback to climate change? Because more CO2 in the atmosphere means more warming, increases biological activity. It could actually start losing soil carbon that way. And so how do we determine whether soils are a friend or foe? And how can we sort of account for these temporal changes, these climate changes, when managing our soils and trying to increase soil health? Some background on me is, I love soils. I've always loved soils. I love the aesthetics experience of soils. I love how the different colors and how they smell and how it feels, and just love digging into the ground. So I've looked at, how soil carbon is responding to global change across many different environments worldwide, and just have some photos to show you all. So I've worked on tundra soils and permafrost soils in the Arctic, in Alaska and Greenland. And here's some pictures from field trips over the past 6 years where we've gone and sampled permafrost soils, trying to understand what's going to happen to these soils as they warm. In a more temperate zone, I have investigated the vulnerability of soil carbon in, well, this is tropical, but Hawaii, California, France, and New England. So in these places, I have run global change experiments, where specifically warming experiments, where we've actually warmed the soil to see what happens to the amount of soil carbon in the soil as these soils warm. Are we losing soil carbon? What types of soil carbon are we losing, and how much of a positive feedback could this be to global change? Some good news with that, at least for farmers. So I've investigated this in tropical forests in Hawaii, in temperate forests in California, and in New England. And here the forests are very vulnerable to losing carbon due to climate change. The one soil warming experiment that we've done in agriculture, so this was in France, we had it in a wheat field and also in a hay field. The picture is sort of in the middle, and then the wheat field is up above. Those soils seem to be a lot less vulnerable to being lost, to have that soil carbon being lost due to warming. So that's some good news. Forest soil is very vulnerable, but these agricultural soils, it seems less so. And I've also worked in pastures across Vermont. And so I have done research funded by a conservation innovation grant, where we've looked at whether planting deep-rooted perennials could help store more carbon in deep soils. That was not a successful project. These deep-rooted perennials that we were using are hard to get established in Vermont. One reason being they oftentimes root deeply as a way to get water in drier environments. And Vermont is pretty music. So that competitive advantage that they have out west is a competitive disadvantage when competing against the pasture grasses here in Vermont. But a lot of this work has been led by Erin Lane, and she is a PhD candidate at Dartmouth that I mentor, but she's also deputy director of the USDA Northeast Climate Hub. So many of you may have heard of her or met her, and she's been leading a lot of this research and some more of the research that I'll be talking about today. So talking about soil organic matter and what are the sources of soil organic matter in the soil. Sorry for this being sort of a forest picture, but the main four sources are the above ground plant parts, so leaf litter. A lot of times this is what gets taken away with farming. However, this above ground plant matter is actually sort of the least important when it comes to soil organic carbon. It's really the plant matter below ground, just like Doug was saying, leaving those roots in, that's really important. And so we have roots as a big source of organic matter below ground. And also we have dissolved organic carbon that's coming from leaching of the above ground plant parts, but also the roots themselves. When the roots are alive, they're actually exudating carbon into the soil. They do that to help feed the microbial communities because they're reliant upon them to be decomposing organic carbon and providing them with nutrients. So they're feeding these exudates to feed microbial communities. They're also delivering some of those exudates to mycorrhiza, so the fungal mycelium that they have a symbiosis with. So that's another source of organic matter. And then what is actually ultimately and the most important source of organic matter in soils are the microbes themselves. So when the microbes die, their dead biomass, which we call necromass, really becomes part of the soil organic matter pool. And so by having a healthy soil with a lot of biological activity, you're also producing a lot of this necromass, which is a really important source of soil organic matter. And this will include like cell walls, cell membranes and stuff from bacteria and fungi. And a lot of times a big source of this necromass, the soil organic matter, are the fungal mycelia themselves. So what I've been interested in is how like soil health correlates with soil carbon storage. We know that if you have a healthy soil, it's positively correlates with the amount of soil carbon that a soil has, because soil health is there's many different metrics of it, but overall it's looking at the biological activity of the soil, and what's feeding that biological activity is soil organic carbon. So generally, the more soil organic carbon a soil has, the healthier it's going to be, the more it's going to be able to provide for that soil food web and all the biological activity that you want in the soil. But when it comes to soil carbon sequestration, and if we want these soils to be storing carbon away from the atmosphere for the long term, one point I wanted to make today is that not all soil carbon is created equal. And just so we're talking about diversity in soil organisms and diversity in plants in the soil, there's also diversity of the soil carbon itself. And so soil carbon is really heterogeneous. It's not all the same. And there's many different ways that we can sort of split soil carbon up. One way that I like to conceptualize it is that we have particulate soil carbon. This tends to be, actual plant parts. So like identifiable plant parts. These pictures show like pieces of roots, pieces of wood. It could be small pieces of leaves. It could be the fungal mycelia. This is the particulate organic carbon. And then we have soil organic carbon that's stored in aggregates. And then we have soil organic carbon that is actually sorbed onto mineral surfaces. And so there's a big difference in sort of the biological activity inherent with these different carbon fractions. We'll call them fractions. The particulate fraction has a high amount of biological activity. It's still in the process of decomposing. The carbon that's in these aggregates or is associated with soil minerals can actually be inaccessible to soil microbes. Inside the aggregates, it could be these really fine pore spaces that the microbes actually cannot get to, and so that protects the carbon from being decomposed. With the mineral associations, the active sites of the organic matter that the microbes would use to sort of help decompose or essentially eat it can be taken up by the mineral, and so the microbes cannot decompose this organic matter. And so when it comes to climate change and how we think of like how to maintain soil carbon, it can be important to think of these different pools or these different fractions. The particulate fraction being biologically active is potentially vulnerable to being lost with climate change and warming, but these aggregated and mineral associated fractions might be more protected because they're not as accessible to the soil microbes. How we get at this heterogeneity oftentimes is through something really simple, just size fractions. And so what we do at the lab, there's different ways to fractionate, but one way, the size fraction, is we'll have a 53 micron sieve. Any of the organic matter that stays on top of that sieve is considered particulate, so the larger sized organic matter. And what falls through the sieve is considered mineral associated organic matter. And we know that there's differences in these pools. So particulate organic matter is quite fast cycling. This is cycling, I say years to decades. It really could be days to years to decades. It's the fast cycling carbon pool. It's what's biologically active. Oftentimes it's made up of this fragmented root and leaf litter and fungal biomass. My lab is now testing this to see how these different fractions are correlated with soil health metrics, but we hypothesize that this particular organic matter being so biologically active is what's going to be really associated with these soil health metrics. Next, we have mineral associated organic matter. This is slower cycling. It can be in the soil for decades to centuries to even thousands of years. So some of this carbon is really old. And it is derived from microbial biomass, that necromass that I talked about. So biological activity is a prerequisite for forming this mineral associated organic matter, but it's less clear how whether the amount of mineral associated organic matter will be associated with soil health, the soil health metrics that we're measuring. It should be associated with soil health because biological activity is a prerequisite to forming this type of organic matter. And so those warming experiments that I mentioned earlier in the introduction of this talk, what I've found with this in warming experiments from Hawaii to California to New England is that that particulate carbon, that biologically active pool, can be quite vulnerable to being lost as the climate changes and the soils warm, but that mineral associated pool generally stays in the soil and isn't lost. So if we're thinking about managing soils for long-term carbon sequestration, we might want to think about trying to manage for that mineral associated organic matter. However, that's still much an open question of how much control we have over it. So active questions my research is looking at is, do these soil carbon fractions relate to soil health metrics? So this is actually one of the chapters of Erin Lane's dissertation, who I mentioned before. And we're also wondering, can we manage for more of this mineral-associated organic carbon? And so those are open questions, and I just wanted to present some of the data we have about these different fractions in Vermont farms. So the first step of answering these questions was just to try to understand how much soil carbon on Vermont farms is actually protected by soil minerals. And we did this in collaboration with Heather Darby and Alyssa White at University of Vermont, who helmed the State of Soil Health Report a couple years ago. So this brought together a bunch of NRCS funded soil projects to sample fields we were working on. And we sampled all these fields in a systematic way. We have, the data I'm presenting now is not from, it's from like half of our samples, but we have over 200 farms or fields that we looked at. So we found that pasture and hay fields tended to have a lower proportion of soil carbon that was associated with minerals than vegetable and row crops. However, this was not because they had less mineral associated carbon, it was because they had significantly more particulate organic carbon. And so there's big differences in these fractions, it seems, by the management type. And these differences are showing up in particulate carbon. When we look at mineral associated carbon, the amount of mineral associated carbon, we see that these 4 land uses all had similar amounts of carbon associated with minerals. And that brings us to that open question of, is this sort of more climate resistant mineral associated organic carbon, can it be managed for? Just without, based on these observations, it's hard to say. It looks like maybe not. And going back to what Kat said about context and context being really important with your soil, it seems that the most important determinant of the amount of mineral associated organic carbon in soils was the soil texture. And so once we get to a sandy clay loams and all the clays and loams sort of above that, those finer soil textures, they tend to have almost twice the amount of mineral associated organic carbon as the sandier soils. And that does make sense because there's more mineral surface area to sort of absorb to the organic matter in the finer textured soils. So what we're going to do as we have more data is we'll now look at the interaction, is knowing that the main sort of determinant of mineral associated organic carbon is the soil texture. Within a soil texture, does management matter? How much control of this do we have? So those are ongoing questions we're looking at. I'd just like to acknowledge everyone in my lab, especially Erin Lane, as well as the NRCS for funding this research. And I've provided Lauren with a paper about these particulate and mineral associated forms of organic matter if you're interested to learn more. This is a scientific paper, but it's written like pretty broadly overview of the topic. So if you're interested in learning more, this would be a good place to start. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Caitlin. I think soil organic carbon has really come up as a key theme that folks have a lot of questions about, and is one of those things that is highly confusing. So we really appreciate your time and your information here. Our next and last panelist is Sarah Simon. And Sarah, I'll let you start putting your slides up on the screen. Beautiful. And so Sarah is the Climate Resilience Specialist for the Maine Farmland Trust, tasked with developing new programs to integrate climate resilience and soil health into the land protection process. She grew up in Massachusetts and first made her way to Maine in 2014 as an apprentice on a diversified vegetable and dairy farm. She then spent 5 years as the director of a community farm and food justice organization in New York's Hudson Valley. She managed 5 acres of produce grown for food access initiatives and developed new programs, including mobile markets, healthcare partnerships, nutrition incentives, and farmers markets management in 2 different cities. Before farming captured her interest, Sarah received her undergraduate degree in comparative literature, creative writing, and dance from Princeton University. And with that, Sarah, whenever you are ready, take it away.
Great. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's fun to go last and have heard the diverse presentations and topics covered. It's a great group. And Caitlin, that was really interesting because the idea that farming can be a natural climate solution and we can make up for all of the deep fossil carbon emitted through human activity by sequestering it in farmland. It's a really attractive prospect, I think, that people get very excited about. And it definitely comes up a lot as we're looking at funding opportunities and what even the USDA is looking to see happen for farmers. And it's really interesting to hear about some of the research happening on what that carbon is actually doing in the soil and what it's doing towards soil health as experienced by farmers too. So my presentation is going to be on a slightly different topic. It's really focused on my work for Maine Farmland Trust, which is, as Lauren said, really focused on how we can bring the emphasis on soil health into the work of a land trust. Maine Farmland Trust is a statewide land trust. We work across Maine, conserving farmland. In many ways, Vermont Land Trust is sort of a peer, similar size scale land trust, but they do focus on forest land, whereas our focus is only on farmland. And typically our easements require only that the land remain open and available for farming. So they're keeping real estate development off of farmland, which is itself a really important climate benefit and way to protect soil. But my role has been to see how we can go one step further and actually incentivize better management practices and also help support farmers as they try to adapt to climate change. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of a big picture about how we understand soil health as a climate resilience strategy. Then I'll talk a little bit about the work I've done with one farm in particular in Maine and what integrating soil health into their farm planning has looked like for them. And then I'll talk about some of what is coming next on the horizon, both for us and in general, as there's a lot of federal funding being directed to these kinds of efforts, being kind of funneled down to farmers that I think will really impact how soil health occurs on farms in the future. So as I mentioned, Maine Farmland Trust, we conserve farmland with conservation easements, mostly purchased easements that also help make the land more affordable by essentially compensating farmers for the development rights. We also have a lot of different programs. We're not as fortunate as you all in Vermont to have the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, which funds a lot of business planning for farmers. We have a lot of great service providers, but we all function a little bit separately. And we've found that it's been necessary to have a business planning team within the land trust as well to work with farmers. We also have some farmland access programs. We host Maine Farm Link, which is a website where people can search for farmland, and also people who own farmland can try to find farmers who will farm their land. And then now we have this new climate resilience work as some of our additional support services beyond the land conservation work. 2 offices in Belfast, Maine and Portland. And at this point, we've now protected nearly 350 farms and over 68,000 acres of farmland. So quite a lot for a private land conservation entity. Not so much actually compared to a lot of the state programs that you see in a lot of other states in the Northeast. So a lot of this was covered already, but I am just going to give a quick overview of soil health as it relates to climate change, because we often at MFT, I've talked about climate resilience. Sometimes I've talked about soil health. They're very interrelated in that better soil health hopefully will allow farms to be more resilient to climate change. But of course, there are also other ways that farms can be resilient to climate change. And what we've done is actually started working with farms on soil health and then broadened our focus to include other strategies as well, like water management, which is of course really related to soil health, like you heard earlier, but also things like on-farm emissions reductions and other things that contribute to a farm's overall resilience. So I think we got a lot of good context. I'm going to go through these slides a little bit more quickly. Climate change, it's happening. Seasons are getting longer. Most importantly, when it comes to soil health, we're seeing changing weather patterns that, as you all know, mean that we get more intense precipitation, more overall, but also coming in more intense bouts at particular times and alternating more frequently with drought. So the key takeaways as they relate to soil are that all these new precipitation patterns have often very negative soil health impacts in terms of compaction, flooding, soil saturation, losing fieldwork days, also unhappy people and farmers who have to work in these conditions and struggle to produce crops when disease can spread more easily. So lots of negative soil health repercussions from these changing patterns. What will it take to be more resilient given those challenges? Well, first on the list, I think, is managing soils differently. And that's how soil health really fits into the overall picture of farm resilience. Managing water differently is also really crucial. And I think relatedly, some of the other strategies that we're seeing interest from farmers in are overall landscape modifications, changing where fields actually are on the property and how they're farmed, the slope of the fields, actually changing land shape and farming on contour, and doing things that maybe weren't as essential in the past to try to really manage these new risks. So as I started working with farmers on the ground, we started out with a small group of 16 farms to try to offer some different resources to essentially help farmers get from these challenges that I showed before to feeling that they could adopt some of these different resilience practices. And I think the really critical thing to mention here as a challenge is that if it were as simple as knowing, the right way to farm for resilience, everyone would do it. And sometimes I think a lot of the rhetoric around something like regenerative agriculture makes it sound like it all works really well and farmers just need to do it. And I think in practice, it's a lot more complicated. People who are farming now have developed certain systems, they have equipment tailored to those systems, and making a shift is really hard conceptually and financially. Another challenge is that farms operate in such different ways and at such different scales. And certain models like the one that we heard about at Bread Seed Farm earlier that work really well if you don't use a lot of machinery and if you have adequate human labor, don't work as well for farms that are reliant on machines. So it's a really big hurdle to overcome with change. And we wanted to offer a few different interventions to see what could really work to help farmers feel like they could make change on their farms and do it with confidence, given that it's really their livelihood at stake. So we did a couple different things in the last 2 years of this pilot. First, all the farms were part of an on-farm research project called the Soil Health Benchmark Study run by PASA Sustainable Agriculture in Pennsylvania. They'll be really scaling that up. I think that someone from NOFA Vermont is on the call. They're partners along with us and a lot of other organizations across the Northeast in enrolling more farmers in this study, which really seeks to help farmers understand the impacts of their management decisions on soil health outcomes. So as measured by soil tests over time. We also got farmers together for winter workshops and summer field days to learn from each other. And then I think really the central piece was having each farm put together what we call a climate resilience plan that helps them think through the risks to their farm in particular, identify adaptation strategies, and then find funding to be able to implement those strategies. So this graphic is an overlay of this USDA framework of climate adaptation, and it shows how those different pieces fit in. So the workshops hopefully build some awareness of different options for farmers. We hope that as a land trust in our role creating easements, we can help farmers do a better job assessing risks. There's the planning piece. Then we made sure to offer funding, not a whole lot so far, but I'll get to this. There's a lot more money coming out now for these kinds of activities to actually undertake some of the activities in the plan. And then being part of this research study, which is kind of the ongoing monitoring and evaluation piece. Is this really working for farms? So the last thing I want to offer is just to give an example of how this has worked in practice for a farm so that it goes from being conceptual to actually hearing about a farm's experience. That farm is Bumbleroot Organic Farm. We worked together for the last 2 years. They're in Windham, Maine, which is about 25 minutes from Portland. So they have a great city market nearby, and they do direct market a lot of their crops, which are veggies and herbs and flowers. Bumbleroot is at a mechanized scale, so they're 89 acres. Not all of that is tillable, but they're currently growing on 7-ish acres. So it's too much for them to farm without machinery. And meanwhile, they're dealing with a lot of the really challenging weather patterns that primarily impact soil health that farmers everywhere are experiencing right now. Intensified storms, 5 inches of rain in a day, unpredictable frosts, high winds, drought, and hailstorms. They're a really interesting farm because, like a lot of the turnover that we're seeing in Maine, that I think may be similar in Vermont, we're seeing a lot of dairy farms come up for sale due to the economics of dairy at the moment. And the types of farmers who are purchasing these farms often plan to do something quite different, like in their case, growing vegetables and flowers and herbs, not dairy. The problem is they're dealing with dairy land. So in their case, the land is rolling and sloped. It's beautiful and scenic. It is a hard place to grow vegetables using traditional tillage practices. And that was one of the main challenges that they identified when they looked at why were they being so impacted by the changing precipitation. They were seeing a lot of erosion on their beds, especially where they weren't able to get the soils in a cover crop going into winter. They also felt that perhaps they hadn't optimally sited fields because they were seeing erosion, and they, like many young farmers, kind of showed up, immediately started planting, had to get a crop in the ground, and only later felt like, I don't know that we planned this out correctly. So they were seeing the loss of some of their soils, as you've already seen. They were seeing difficulties with pest and disease pressure, decreased crop yields, and crop quality. So what we did in our planning process was to come up with short, medium, and long-term goals. And I want to emphasize that in many cases, these were not brand new ideas to the farm. A lot of these were thoughts they'd had for a long time. And I think what I did as a service provider was helping to organize those thoughts into things that could happen on a timeline, and then eventually how they could fund and take on these tasks and what kind of knowledge they needed. So I just want to emphasize, since this is a service provider audience, that just helping people take these kind of big challenges like climate change, like soil health, and break them down into actionable steps, I think is a really important service. So some of the short-term actions, they wanted to continue trialing reduced tillage and no-till on some of the areas where they had flat ground, where they felt they could, make beds shorter and manage it at a hand scale level. On the fields that they were managing with tractors, their priorities were to integrate cover crops in, and to also have a better erosion control plan that wouldn't involve, shifting their actual practices. But what they decided to do was to have perennial strips, which are called contour buffer strips, in between their rows of tilled crops to hold the soil in place better. They also received funding from NRCS to put in a pollinator meadow and a windbreak of native plants. These were really interesting interventions to me because they weren't happening on their farm fields where they're producing crops, but rather outside of their cropped areas. So these were interventions that they were making that happened elsewhere, but they felt served the overall resilience of the farm by reducing erosion due to wind and increasing biodiversity. And then they had long-term goals around transitioning to renewable energy and managing their forests better. So I'll just highlight a couple of these. Their no-till system, I think, was pretty similar to what was described earlier. Those are wood chips in their path. And these are some of the fields they have in the study. So they're actually getting to see how this changes soil health over time, which I think speaks to the importance of the study to give people data on what's really happening so that they can account for example, a really off year like this past year where maybe yields were lower. They can hopefully have some other information coming in other than their direct experience, which was mostly negative, to know that things are changing overall, even though a given season may be really challenging. And then, as I mentioned, they had this medium-term strategy that they're still working on implementing, which is to eventually put in all of these strips of perennial crops in between their annual crops, even where they are using tillage. And this, I think, speaks to what I was getting at before, which is that, for a lot of farms, it's really hard to make the shift. And this is a way that they can try to keep their soils in place without necessarily completely changing their production system to move away from tillage entirely. And then in their long-term strategy, they started working with a permaculture designer. The worlds of permaculture and production farming don't always talk to each other. They often seem like they're going in opposite directions. But this was an interesting case where they found someone they wanted to work with who put together this really exciting aspirational plan for their farm that involves integrating a lot more trees and ponds to allow the water to slow and sink and spread, like we heard about at the beginning. And this is a really exciting direction for them. And I think shows the way that not only planning out the steps, but also having a visual for what the farm could look like can be really exciting. So we felt that this planning process was pretty meaningful and are hoping to expand and work with many more farms across the state on both the planning process and then providing funding. Bumbleroot was one of the farms that reached out to be part of our pilot group of 16 farms. They've been thinking about these things and worrying about climate change for a long time. I think the next step is to start working with more farms for whom these issues are not as much of a priority and see where and how we can invest in those farms and their resilience. This, I think, fits in really well with our easement process because the easement often really constrains what farms can do in terms of where they can put buildings, restricting their ability to just go dig a pond or just plant trees anywhere. So the more that we can plan with farms, the more I think their relationship with their easement will be more positive. We're also going to provide some grants that will allow people to fund the kinds of soil health investments that NRCS might provide, but on a more urgent timeline. Perhaps things are different in Vermont. I hope so. But the NRCS timeline often takes a while to actually get funding out to farmers, and there's often not enough to meet the need. So we feel like there's room to provide more flexible private funding that can support farmers on a shorter timeline. We'll be offering more of these land planning and design services to farmers in-house because there aren't a lot of designers who typically work with farmers, and we're fortunate to have a couple of people with a design background on staff. So that'll be something that we do. And then there are a lot of new partnerships, like I mentioned, with the research study that we're part of, and that I think you all in Vermont will be part of too, such as the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities grants, which is what will be funding the expansion of the research study that I mentioned, as well as a lot of great funding for farms to actually undertake climate smart projects. We also, it's great to hear you mention Erin Lane. She's been part of something called the Climate Adaptation Fellowship that we've been involved with as well through the University of Maine and some staff there. And that will help us really expand the planning services we're offering. And then we have a really exciting new agreement with NRCS in Maine to actually share a staff person who will be able to do both NRCS's conservation planning as well as our more holistic planning with farmers, which I'm really excited about because NRCS has a lot of funding coming their way for soil health practices via the Inflation Reduction Act. They are rapidly working to staff up to have enough people to get the money out the door, but I think that that's a challenge probably everywhere. And so we're excited to add just a little bit of staff capacity, but also hopefully to make that added capacity meaningful by giving this staff person the flexibility to do a more holistic plan with a farm, and then kind of walk through the door at NRCS with that plan and get those activities funded to the extent that they can be. So I wanted to share a lot of this just to share what we're doing in Maine in the hopes that it inspires things that could be or maybe already are happening in Vermont. We would love to have more dialogue, especially with others who are working at this intersection of land conservation and trying to really interpret that in a way that incorporates soil health versus being solely focused on legal easement restrictions. Last thing that I will share, which I think unfortunately will be limited to Maine, but maybe you can check it out and create something similar in Vermont. We're working on a cool GIS-based tool that will use available climate projections to let people look up properties and see the specific risks that climate change poses on that site. So they'll be able to see a score that reflects both the characteristics of the farm, like whether there's water available, as well as the future projections on that particular site to the extent that, you know, you can get granular with the data. of things like how much temperatures will change and how much precipitation will change. One cool thing we factored in for the soil health crowd is we've adapted NRCS's Russell tool, which measures erosion risk, into something that, you know, it's not going to be perfect, but it can be run using the GIS coordinates on different fields. So you can get kind of an approximate sense of how high the erosion risk is on one field versus another, which again, the hope is this could inform farmers before they go and till a field that has a really steep slope or really highly erodible soils, for example. So this image is from Cornell, their climate smart farming tool. It's just to give you kind of a sense of what it will look like. We're actually about to launch this tool, and so I can share that as a resource with everybody once we're officially launched, and then you're welcome to steal the idea and make something in Vermont, or we can work with you. That'd be fun. So we can keep the knowledge going. So thank you. Hopefully this is helpful. Again, it's really how do we take the principles of soil health and turn them into action on farms, which I think has a lot to do with technical capability and funding. It also has a lot to do with people and their willingness and openness to change. And I think that's a good note to end on, because it's a sort of unspoken basis for the planning process we went through, is that it really involved developing a relationship with the farmer. And I think that's an often undermentioned but really important aspect of being a service provider, is that it's really about being a supporter and a friend to the people you work with more than anything.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I just want to ask you a quick clarifying question from the chat. For Bumble Root Farm, there was a question that if those beds were hand tilled at Bumble Root. I don't know if you can speak to that.
The beds, let me just try to reshare the photo. I think the answer is no, basically.
Right.
But they pretty much use a tractor for everything. There are these beds in particular, this is their no-till section. Most of the farm is still being tilled using machines. They did run tillage equipment, a Perfecta here, before putting in place this no-till system, which has compost and wood chips. At this point, their hope is that they won't run tillage machinery here again, but also that they won't be doing any hand tilling or double digging with shovels or anything. The soil is intended just not to be turned anymore, and they may just reapply compost if needed.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I just want to encourage folks, or I guess first I want to thank everyone on the panel for all of your very beautifully connected presentations, and just for your time. I want to encourage folks who are still here to please continue putting questions in the chat. Any that we don't get to, we will follow up with after this event. The first question that we're going to move into for the panel, and so again, Caitlin, Doug, Sarah, Kat, anyone can chime in on this. What information or skills would be helpful for technical assistance providers to have to help land stewards such as farmers, forest owners, or residential landowners? I know, Sarah, you just mentioned some of the relationship building and trust, but would like to open up for whoever would like to speak towards that. And I'll let you each come off mute. And it might get a little messy, but I think I'll be fine.
The one that I wanted to bring up, which I think Sarah covered really nicely in her presentation with that web tool, is thinking about climate change and how the management practices that you're advocating for, how those are going to be affected by climate change and being adaptable moving forward. I think nothing is going to be static anymore. And so we really have to sort of take into account these changes when deciding how to manage for soil health.
Thanks, Caitlin.
I could speak on this a little. I think important for us as farmers in the field, like it's easy for me to take a soil test and send that off to a lab and get results and understand nutritional content of the soil, but testing for carbon and biological activity, so maybe microscopes to test for biology, and I'm not aware of how to test carbon in the soil, but yeah, some sort of test that could test for carbon and see what we're actually capturing and putting back in the soil versus releasing it.
Well, to speak to that, Doug, the good news is that you have organic matter content, right? So you said your farm's gone from 6 to 8% organic matter content. And the easiest thing, there's a back of the envelope calculation, you just divide that in half, and that's how your carbon content has changed. So you've gone to 3 to 4%, likely. But again, I know Alyssa White is gonna and Heather Darby are gonna come, but the Cornell cache analysis, the comprehensive assessment of soil health analysis, does measure carbon, and it measures a lot of this sort of biological activity. It's a more expensive analysis to do, but it is really amazing.
I'll put in a plug that we use Cornell for the soil health benchmark study, and that'll be available to farmers in Vermont through NOFA Vermont. I think it's Nancy on the call who's a part of that. So that's a good way the study pays for the cache analysis, which helps cover the cost for farmers. It can be quite significant.
Thanks, and I'll actually chime in to that point too. There are a few folks with UVM extension and some of the conservation districts have been piloting some cache studies as well on some farms outside of the state of soil health, and are definitely getting some experience interpreting those test results. Lindsay Rule will also be speaking to some of those items at her talk later in this webinar series. Kat, I don't know if you wanted to speak towards technical assistance providers too.
Yeah, actually, I think so. I do technical service providing around composting on farms, and one of the things that I have learned that's very helpful is being able to meet farmers where they're at with their lifestyles. I mentioned this a little bit in my presentation, just understanding the limitations, the human limitations. And I loved all these presentations. And in the last one, I really liked the idea of helping farmers to identify next steps in a long-term plan. So it doesn't have to happen right away. And what we're really doing is measuring change over time. So meeting farmers where they're at with schedules, children, finances, physical capacity, abilities and inabilities, all of that, matching them with folks that might be able to fill in some of those gaps in knowledge, and then doing a realistic plan with intention and follow through to look at the changes that are taking place, and then remaining adaptable as your outcomes come in so that you can continue. And I think that adaptability is especially important as we live in a world with really crazy, unpredictable weather, and not giving up and being patient. So yeah, just patience, slow, lots of listening, I think is really important.
Thank you. I'm going to go to one of the other questions in the chat. And I want to also just invite, so I'll ask the speakers to speak to this, but also if anyone on the call can speak to it as well. Has anyone found a good alternative to black plastic tarp? And that question had come through when Doug was chatting about that practice on his farm. I'm not sure if anyone of the speakers wants to speak to it or if anyone else wants to chime in the chat.
Well, I don't have a good alternative, but I'm happy to speak about some of the things that I've seen farmers, kind of ways they've adapted different strategies, because it's definitely a concern. I mean, I think so essentially the black plastic is a weeding strategy on organic farms, and the very small scale no-till is replacing the plastic with compost, at least in the system that's most common in Maine. The idea is that you're putting down a thick enough layer of compost that you're essentially replacing your soil with compost. And if the compost was produced well, it should be weed free. So that's sort of a solution that works on the small scale if you are comfortable spending that much money on compost. At a larger scale, one of the farms I'm working with, it's an excellent farm. He's doing a great job, and he just feels he can't go without the plastic because it's what lets him grow organically at a significant scale. And his sort of balancing act is that he's also cover cropping in between the rows of plastic. So he's trying to sort of build soil health in one way, even as he's introducing this unnatural material in another way. But unfortunately, I really don't think there are great answers. It's nice that the tarps are reusable. It seems that the biodegradable black plastic is not something that most farms feel all that great about either, because it's made from GMO corn and it doesn't break down all that well. I know some farms that have used a kind of paper that's a sort of paper mulch, but I hear that it rips really easily. So I'd love to hear from anyone else. I think it's a really important issue in the organic farming community that it's that plastic use is so widespread, and not just on soil directly, but also in greenhouses where it does need to be changed every few years. And it's an important thing to be raising up, even as we celebrate the advances that people farming organically or regeneratively have made, that we still have a lot of tricky situations when it comes to weeding at a larger scale. I'll just add one last thing. Sorry, I've talked for a while. And that's just that there is some interesting innovation happening with the idea of no-till at a larger scale happening through the use of a roller crimper to roll down cover crop and plant into it directly. And then the rolled down cover crop functions as a mulch, so sort of replacing the roll of plastic. And I think that's exciting, but it's not something that I think is yet really widespread, and hopefully one day it will be.
Thanks, Sarah. Any other speakers want to speak to that? If not, we've got some more questions. All right. This question is kind of targeted towards you, Doug. This is from Megan. She said, it's really incredible to hear about your successes on the farm in a relatively short amount of time. Nice work. But could you also talk a little bit about how the wet conditions this season impacted your growing and soil health practices? What held up, what didn't? Are you thinking about making any changes in future years as things kind of get more extreme?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I actually meant to kind of touch on this in the presentation. Was yeah, we had our best year at Breadseed. It's limited. It's only our third year there. Luckily, we're not Riverland farm. We're a hill farm. So we're farming up on a hill. We're at 1,500 feet elevation, which has its pros and cons. But on July 11th, after the big storm, we had 9 to 10 inches of rain in Craftsbury in 36 hours, I would say about, but we were harvesting at 8 a.m. that morning. I think the beds being broad forked, heavily composted, like Sarah had mentioned, 2 inches of compost, plus broad forked, light, airy, decompacted, always having living plant roots in there. Mulch in the wood chips in the pathways just really soaked up that water. My boots weren't even muddy on Tuesday morning or whatever morning that was. We were able to get in there, harvest, and send that out for wholesale. That being said, we had some of the best yields for some crops, but we also had a really down year with the consistency and duration of the rain. I think the biggest issue I saw on the farm was pollination issues, because of the constant rain, getting pollinators in there to pollinate winter squash, say. Yeah, that was our biggest issue. So yeah, some hits, some misses, but overall a positive year, and really positive that next morning when everything was flooding, to be able to have some normalcy and get out there and do what we do, given the circumstances of that day.
Thank you very much, Doug. I wanted to next go to this question in the chat about some of the personalities that are at the forefront of the soil health movement, and just kind of getting the question was asked, how do we interpret some of the good information from folks, but also check ourselves and make sure that the context is staying in place. I know there was a couple of responses about just how important that context is, and if the outcomes are working on your farm based on the principles and practices from other folks, then that's great. Our hope in this soil health training program is to equip all of you with the information to have a nuanced approach to soil health so that you can interpret what you're hearing from different personalities, different experts, and really come to a conclusion and some places of truth for yourself and the folks you're supporting. So thank you for that. And then not necessarily a question, but Megan also put in the chat, just underscoring what Kat said about meeting farmers where they are and how staff and childcare can really create barriers and opportunities for farmers to be implementing changes there. I'm not seeing too many other questions right now. And so I guess I'll just ask any of the speakers if you'd like to say any parting words to this group. Oh, Mel, sorry, go ahead.
Hi, I'm sorry, I have a question. I just want to take advantage of the fact that we have carbon and climate specialists here, and maybe speak to a little bit of what Sarah was saying about creating those, trusting relationships with farmers. A lot of the technical service providers I've been speaking with, we are having these discussions about how to communicate climate change to farmers that you're working with or other land stewards, and how sometimes it can be really difficult to communicate that with folks who don't necessarily want to use the words climate change. And you sometimes hit this wall where you can talk about resiliency and adaptation, but you can't really talk about mitigation or carbon emissions or anything like that. So I'm wondering, for those who work with farmers and those who communicate the science to farmers, how do you sort of balance that line of, being realistic about what's happening and trying to work towards mitigation and adaptation while also not ruining those relationships?
Well, I would say there's no reason to talk about mitigation because soil health and soil carbon are correlated. And so you can just talk about soil health and meet the farmers where they are in terms of where their goals are. There's probably some farmers who are going to say like their number one goal could be, obviously production, but then number two might be mitigation. But, everyone wants to have a healthy soil. It's going to meet a variety of different management goals and ecosystem services. You don't have to mention the mitigation. And then in terms of adaptation, you don't have to call it climate change. You could talk about the climate variability, and the variability is increasing, and just talk about what. So I have a friend who works with farmers down in Georgia where this is a huge issue. Like most of them are not going to acknowledge this. And the way she starts is always ask them how they've seen conditions and like weather conditions change on their land. And they'll have stories and they'll know how things have changed, and sort of going with their sort of personal experiences and starting there and planning around that.
Yeah, I think those are great suggestions, and everyone is familiar with the issues that they're facing in the weather. Everyone wants to build soil. I think those are great common ground. I just wanted to add though that just in the last couple of years, I think, there's been a shift in tone, at least where federal government programs are concerned. So now NRCS has its climate smart agriculture and forestry practices. This, big national grants that we're part of are called Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. I think that the existence of that has led me to shy away less from using the term climate and climate smart, just because they're starting to be kind of in the language that we're using, and I think getting a little bit normalized, at least for farmers who want to work with the federal government, which is also a subset. But I don't know. So I would just say that I think there's been a little bit of shift of the comfort level in the last few years with having these words as part of outreach. So I think it's okay too to kind of test the boundaries and start having these conversations, and there might be less pushback than we think. But that said, I think we're still in the place where we're going to start really trying to work with a more diverse group of farmers. And I think that the suggestions that Caitlin gave are really great ways to begin those relationships.
Wonderful and well timed, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen for this last couple minutes here. Just to give a brief overview of what to expect for next week. So we'll meet again a week from today on Tuesday, December 12th from 2 to 4 p.m. I'll be sure to not get the date wrong in the email next time. And we will be learning from Fred Magdoff about soil structure and chemistry. And if that name sounds familiar, he's one of the co-authors on the books that we're using as a course textbook. So be sure to do your reading. What we'd like to ask between now and then is that you fill out the evaluation form. And I'm realizing that link is not clickable, so I will get that in the chat momentarily. Practice teaching and applying the information that you learned from today's webinar. You know, we're kind of going through the approach of see one, do one, teach one. And so hopefully people are going to be using this information and really practicing it with folks. It doesn't have to be anyone that you're working with. It can be a friend, it can be a peer, it can be your boss. Feel free to teach them something that you learned today. A reminder to set up your campus account. I will send out the instructions for how to do that again. If you have any questions though, as you're doing that, please just email our info@franklincountynrcd.org email address and we'll help you do that. Once you get it set up, go ahead and use it. Explore the recommended resources from today and also for the next upcoming session. Feel free to ask more questions and have conversations in the discussion section on campus. I know it's not always the friendliest tool, but I think if people are committed to using it, it'll be really exciting. And make sure to read the chapter 2 and 5 of the Building Soils for Better Crops for next time. That will be some of the content that Fred will be talking about next week. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to find that link and put it in the chat. Oh, thank you, Mel. Hero. Mel put it in the chat. And just deeply thank all of our speakers today for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, your own journeys in soil health, and really inspiring this crew. So thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who came. And we're very excited for next week. With that, have a good rest of your day and just stay well.